do, I'd like to invite the Prime Minister to start the debate. Can you time, or like Harish, and then just type into the chat so everyone's kind of aware what the time is?
Sure.
PM, whenever you're ready.
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So 3, 2, 1, go. I'm going to talk about 3 things in my speech. First of all, about what the virtue means and what sort of forgiveness do you think that will happen even after the regret of this motion? What is the world we picture that will happen? Secondly, how is this forgiveness affect the personal relationships of people? And thirdly, how it affects some sort of broad societal changes and why you think it makes them much worse as well. Definition will obviously be within the first point. So let's begin. We think that what we mean by saying the virtue is of forgiveness is things like the premises of the modern Christianity, or just the premises that people say to one another in specifically 2 regards. First of all, the want that people will forget what the bad things that were done. The ability of people to just say, we have a blank page for someone, those things are forgiven and gone. Secondly, is specifically the second chances of people, even when they don't change significantly. We think that when you say you should turn the other cheek to someone who hurts you, we think that even if this someone has not changed significantly his ways, we still have some sort of like a societal power that wants you to forgive to this person. We think that this specific power, this turn your other cheek, is the bad thing. Why do we think that that the other things that will happen are much better? Because first of all, we think that there are many good reasons not to forgive to other people. First of all, the fact that they have done already damage to you means that they might do this damage again. And just pushing them away from you is a good thing for you, because otherwise you might be hurt. We think this is generally a good reason not to forgive. Secondly, we think that if you don't forgive to someone and therefore this someone is hurt, this someone has now an incentive to change his behavior. If they want to be close to you, if they want to have the privileges that they had before, that means that they want to change and redeem themselves, which we think is a good thing, because if they've done something bad and then they are going to change, it is a good thing. And thirdly, there is also a deterrence effect, like in any other punishment. We think that if consistently you show as a society that you don't forgive certain behaviors, then people are not going to do these behaviors as much because they're going to be harmed. So we think that generally, even if there is going to be no forgiveness, there are good things for it. But we think that people obviously are also going to forgive in some aspects. Who is that showing an actual remorse, is actually trying to apologize in a significant way and trying to show that he has changed his ways. We think that this will only happen if the victim will think that the offender has changed his way in a significant way, and therefore forgiveness is due. But second important difference that happens in our world, the power is in the victim's hand. Today, there is an assumption that the victim must forgive. But after this change is happening, when we don't have these premises of like turn your other cheek, we think there is give much more power to the victim to set their own terms to when forgiveness is going to happen, and therefore what change they want to see in the world. Any clarifications about what we think is going to happen? Obviously, what we mean by regretting is just if the world will have this definition that we talk about, it would be a better world. We obviously not talk about ancient history or stuff like that. We think it's irrelevant. Great. Let's move on to the second point. How does those things affect interpersonal relationships? Because the first thing we want to note here is that there is a huge power disparity within the society. That means that certain people are much more likely to forgive than other people, and certain people are much more likely to do harms than other people. What are those differences? We think that specifically for groups with higher privileges, like men, white people, or richer people, even middle-class people, when you have all sorts of other virtues that are being installed in them that in many cases overrides the virtues of empathy or the virtues of forgiveness that do prevail more in the other groups in the society. How do we see that? First of all, we see that for many of those people, they are being taught that they deserve stuff. They are entitled to get those stuff, and they should have, like, try to pursue all of their dreams and everything they want, and don't care about the feelings of other people. Secondly, I think that specifically within the capitalistic society that we live in, there is a huge sense that people think that it is all in the game. You can do whatever you want, and everything is a legitimate gameplay for you. But this thing does not affect in the same way the weaker groups within the society. Women who are being pushed much more to forgive other people. Poor people or people of minorities who are being pushed to forgive because everyone can be harmful to them in some way. So what is the effect of that specifically on the relationships of people? First of all, we just think it means, because of the deterrent stuff and all of the stuff I talked about before, that more people are being harmed. We think that generally speaking, if people are not pushing this tool onto their offenders, the offenders are going to do more offenses and harm specifically the weaker parts in our society more. But secondly, we think that there are certain aspects that comes to effect even more so. What are those? First of all, with the international relationships between, let's say, men and women. Why do we see that it works there? First of all, even within the day-to-day aspects, we think that men are allowed much more to do minor stuff or even major stuff that hurts the women, like not taking your dishes or cheating on your girlfriend. And we think that when you know that your girlfriend is going to forgive you, you're going to do less within the household works or less within actually caring about her feelings and try to, like, make her feel better. Before I move on, I will take second if they have anything.
Sure.
First, yes, second.
Sure. What is the ability, what other abilities do people in your society have from people that you just discussed to affect society?
We think that obviously men wants to be in relationships with women. We think that today minorities do have a great power to, like, create social movements or get, like, attention in the media or stuff like that. I will describe how this change is going to happen, but we think that obviously because affection is needed from one group to another, they will want to stay in touch, and therefore all of the deterrence effect and redeeming effect is going to happen. So specifically, we think it's even more important in abusive relationships, because in many ways, abusive relationships are built upon the fact that women must forgive the men no matter what they do, which means that women stay much longer within this relationship, and for many women it means day-to-day suffering. But also, we think it's probably affecting a lot of the sexual abuses that we see within the society. We think that in many cases, the gray line men picture in their mind is existing because they know that the women is not going to say anything. They probably think that they are at fault as well. They probably would think they should forgive you because you didn't know that she doesn't really want to do those things. We think that if men wouldn't think this way, then those women will have much more power and much less sexual abuses will happen. We think that when women do come forward, as we've seen in the Me Too movement and stuff like that, it is causing change. But the fact that women are taught to forgive is creating less of those movements, therefore creates less change and more offenses within the society. I beg you to propose.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the leader of opposition to start the oral case. Opening opposition.
3, 2, 1, go. To clarify, forgiveness does not mean forgetting the wrongs that have been inflicted upon you. That's why the phrase forgive and forget has the word and in between it. That's why there are still laws, even though there is the value of forgiveness. That's why there's still the value of enforcement. That's why there's still virtues of justice and fairness. To forgive is to acknowledge a pain that has been inflicted upon you, and to say that the person that inflicted it was not a bad person, was not an evil person, and was not a person that you will carry anger around thinking about for the rest of your life. So there are 3 things that I will do in this speech. The first is to deal with the mischaracterization that we hear from OG as to forgiveness correlating to the absence of punishment and therefore the feeling that people can do whatever they want. The second is to give the most important benefit of forgiveness, which is that it allows processes of healing which best place power in the hands of the victim. And the third is to say why this belief that forgiveness is a virtue is better for the way society functions in fixing structures of privilege. So firstly, looking to the characterization of what it means to have a belief in forgiveness. Essentially, OG premises this idea that to have a belief that forgiveness is a virtue correlates to never punishing people or rarely punishing people, to erring on the side of leniency and to avoiding forms of retribution or vengeance. And they kind of make this upon two assertions. The first one being that forgiveness equals forgetting, which I think is just epistemologically untrue. But secondly, this idea that forgiveness is correlated to this idea of turning the second cheek or otherwise ceding to the powers of people around you. There are 5 reasons why forgiveness is not mutually exclusive to the existence of punishment or to the existence of expectations that people be held accountable for their actions where they breach a certain standard. Firstly, that there are a set of other countervailing and equivalent virtues that err on the side of punishment. Things like justice, things like fairness, which are similarly enshrined within societies and similarly enshrined within norms, which are equalized to the extent that you're deciding the ways that things work. Secondly, that individuals have emotional responses when hurt is done, when there is wrong, when there is trauma. You don't like to feel hurt. People don't like to see other people hurt. There is a sense of pain. There is a sense of wrong. And those strong reactions, the form of backlash, the forms of reactions that people have incentivize and encourage action to be taken to fix it. Thirdly, that there are countervailing norms and incentives. For example, the government has incentive to create mechanisms of control. Privileged groups have incentives to ensure that there are laws, and those things ensure that there are structures of punishment that exist and that are in place, which are likely to occur. Fourthly, that the nature of forgiveness is one which is not about the absence of accountability. It is instead about the attribution of moral blame or of moral worth, or being a bad person or an evil person as opposed to being a good person that has done a bad thing, that has hurt you, but is forgivable in the way that they have hurt you. The final thing I will say here in terms of structures of privilege. Structures of privilege are not mutually exclusive in this debate. OG has structures of privilege as well, and in their world where forgiveness is not a value, and instead the value of things like retribution and vengeance, that errs far more strongly on the ideas of structures of privilege. In their worlds, people who are privileged will still get away unpunished because they are the individuals that control the structures that set the laws. They are the people that can pay their way out of courts. They are the people that have the power, that have the capital, that have the voices, that have the social norms in their favor. But the people that are disprivileged in our world have this norm of being forgiven as a virtue, even when they are unforgivable within the eyes of the privileged structure, because to forgive those people is a virtuous thing to do. So the benefit accrues most to them. But in their world, where vengeance and retribution and there's no need to forgive, that is the world in which things like lynch mobs are most acceptable, when things like backlash against minority groups are within the norm of a society as opposed to against it. And it is in their world where people with privilege are best able to mobilize anger and power and retributionary narratives to ensure the infliction of suffering upon the minorities. Secondly, then, why forgiveness is particularly useful, because obviously the way that norms of forgiveness most are internalized are within the ways that individuals deal with themselves and deal with the people around them as opposed to societal standards. And that's because it's a question of virtue, and a question of virtue is very personal, is very internal, and also because the question of forgiveness is one that only arises when you have been hurt. You don't need to forgive people when you're happy. You don't need to forgive people when something is going on in your life. Forgiveness occurs at the point in time when something has been done against you that is hurtful, that is painful, that is traumatic in some way. And we say that this belief of forgiveness is preferable to you as the victim because it best empowers you with the tools to heal and the tools to move past that hurt, so that the hurt that privileged people inflict upon you does not define you for the rest of your life. 3 reasons. Firstly, you are more likely to forgive other people in the world in which this belief exists. I think that without the norm of forgiveness, you're unlikely to, because it's hard to want to forgive someone. It's difficult to know what it looks like to forgive someone, what steps it is to be taken. The people around you are unlikely to tell you to forgive someone. So when there's this norm that forgiveness is the virtue, it gives you an option of forgiveness, which kind of broadens the range of reactions that are acceptable when someone has hurt you. The benefits are 3. Firstly, it allows you to let go of the pain that has suffered. To forgive someone means to say, you have hurt me, but I forgive you. You do not have power over me. I will not cling to this anger. I will not cling to this pain. You do not define me. And I think when you forgive someone, it necessarily attaches to a reason. I forgive you because the pain that you caused me made me stronger. I forgive you because the pain you caused me taught me how to love. I forgive you because you are an important person in my life, my best friend, my mother, and that matters more to me than this single wrong thing that you did. And that explanation, as well as that initial step of disentanglement, are incredibly powerful for the processes of healing, because not only are you able to let go of those emotions which you cling to when you're upset or when you're in pain, but you're also able to give yourself a narrative which you can strengthen. Secondly, because this belief in forgiveness is a belief that that people are ultimately forgivable, that people are good. So even if you cannot let go, because some traumas are so hard that you cannot, that you are able to feel hopeful that the world is good, that most people are forgivable, that there's something good in the world, and that we shouldn't be angry, but that there is more out there. Thirdly, because the norm of forgiveness also is internal, you're able to forgive yourself, whether you can or cannot forgive, and that people are able to forgive you for not being able to heal or for not being able to recover, because that expectation that you be perfect is not something that is you have done wrong in that instance. And you're able to say, well, I forgive me for being in pain. I forgive me for struggling. I forgive me for the fact that this has hurt me and made my life worse. And that ability to weaponize that narrative, which otherwise cannot be available, particularly to women, is something that is very important in that process of healing. Thirdly, and quickly, forgiveness is better societally for two main reasons. Firstly, where there are norms of forgiveness, instead of attributing bad behaviors to specific individuals, you look to systems of privilege. And that is the way that you're most likely to get change, as opposed to over-punishing specific men or specific people within privileged structures, which is what OG would prefer to do. And in that world, where instead of creating like scapegoats, you're more likely to structurally cause change. And secondly, that the types of people that are likely to be punished, like minorities who are over-policed, are more likely to be seen in the world as capable of rehabilitation, as not fundamentally bad, as not fundamentally evil, in a way that gives them a chance when every other norm in society says that they do not have one. Listen, lots of virtues are bad, but the norm of forgiveness is one which allows the most power to the people that have been most hurt, both by society and by the people around them. It's incredibly important to propose.
Thank you very much. I'd like to invite the Deputy Prime Minister.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, excellent. Okay. I think that OO mischaracterized our stance in the debate, because notice that we are okay with forgiving once a certain threshold has been met. We think that in our world, when there is no virtue of forgiveness, and notice that this is the key word in the motion, what we are going to have is we are going to have real apologies. And we might have people that still decide out of a pure self-interest to continue on relationships, and yet not to necessarily look at the other person without prejudice. Why is this so important? Because what we characterize as the problem of this being a virtue is that there is too much forgiving in the world, is that there is constant pressure on people from the moment that a wrongdoing has been done to them to be the greater person. When they go low, you should go high. And we say that this is exactly the kind of thing that only disempowers victims, because they constantly think that if they don't forgive, they are not moral human beings. They are not acting in a way that is proper. And society tells them, why can't you forgive? Why can't you let go? In our world, the victim actually has more of the ability to take the time to be with the pain, to be with the hurt, and to say, yes, I might forgive only after years. I might forgive only if you really admit that you have done something wrong, and not if you say things like, I'm sorry you were offended for that, and then everyone else around you says, okay, you should forgive him. Obviously, this is not a bad person. He's really good. Look, he's such a good boy. He comes from a good neighborhood, and so on. Or, look, of course, this Karen that called the police on someone in the park just because he was African American didn't mean that she shouldn't lose her job, right? It's not fair for us as a society to go against her. This is exactly the kind of false positive that is happening if this is a virtue. And we say no more to that. We want to have a society in which people that are perpetrators, people that are wrongdoers, know that they are going to face more scrutiny under their world. Now we get this characterization from saying, well, look, but punishment still exists. But notice that the virtue of forgiveness is even something that affects the current institutions that we have. We give a lesser of a punishment to people who say they are sorry, and we have no ability to actually know whether they mean it or simply they don't want to go to jail that much. We actually allow people to come back to their workplace if they are sorry for saying something racist, although we have no ability to discern what they are doing. So this does have an impact, but notice that even if this doesn't have an impact, we say that the impact on the victims and the impact on societal change are great enough for us to try to do this change as a whole. Now, notice that you can't go under the assumption that we now don't disconnect the wrongdoing of the person from the person. OO believes that people are good. We say not all people are good, and we would rather help the victims more, and we would rather punish people more than to make the other mistake on the other side. Now, why do we think that we actually have the ability to create less wrongdoings in a world where we don't have the virtue of forgiveness? So we think that the way often to create social change is through people knowing that there is real deterrence to what they do, and the ability for us to use real life examples in order to learn what is right and what is wrong. Notice that it's very easy to talk in the abstract about racism, but often it takes specific cases and specific people in order for us to identify exactly what is the problem and what is wrong. If we have, though, the virtue of forgiveness, notice that we are under a lot of pressure to move on. We are under a lot of pressure to say, well, we are bigger than that. We don't have to deal with that person. But what is then the problem? The problem is if someone is really bad, they can use this as a get out of jail free card, meaning that they now are freer to continue on doing other things, and other people in society either believing them because they were forgiven or thinking that if the victim has forgiven, they must be good people. Secondly, we say that even people that are not that bad now get moral licensing to continue. Oftentimes, you feel vindicated or obsoleted if you are given forgiveness by someone else. This means that you take away from the wrongness of the things that you have done by saying, I am still a good person. We think that this is often the kind of thing that allows people to do more wrong things because they disassociate the things that they do from the things that they feel about themselves. Thirdly, we say that we create less deterrence on others, and we think that yes, it's good if Karen loses her job. We say yes, it's good if there are people that are harmed along the way, because then we wouldn't have to go on to the next victim and say, oh, the writing was on the wall. But actually, we have more of an ability to say, we are not playing by your rules. We are not willing to forgive and to move on. So even if it's not forgetting, we say that even forgiving is oftentimes very wrong in this aspect. Before I continue, a POI from someone? Yes.
Is that us?
Yes.
What should I ask?
Okay, I'm sorry, it's too much time. Okay, also we say, if we are talking about here the victim, notice that we get this assertion that the victim is better off in the day after if they learn to forget. But they are not dealing with the fact that they are pressured often into this forgiveness. B, we think that oftentimes there are better mechanisms. We don't think you need to associate this specific person and forgiving them in order to trust other people. We think that you have the ability to go on with life and to do, CBT, to say the world isn't that bad, but this person is not worthy. this person is not good. And we think that if people now in our world understand that in order to get forgiveness, they have to work really hard, that is the kind of thing that can really help you, because that takes away from your blame only if you get a real apology, something that today we disencourage people from doing, because automatically people feel like we should forgive them for what they're doing. So for all of these reasons, I'm very, very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much. To close the top half, I'd like to invite the Deputy Leader of Opposition.
Thank you. In order to believe that the world is good, that it is fundamentally safe, you have to believe that people are good, because the world is made up of the people that create it and who you interact with, and your safety is dependent on other people. And in order to believe that most people are good, you have to believe that most of the hurt that is caused is hurt that ought to be forgiven, because it is hurt that is made by mistakes, by people who are caught up in confusing situations, the kind of hurt that you yourself forgive. That is why when we find ourselves in therapy, it is often less time spent with therapists, as DPM suggests, pressuring us to forgive our attacker, and more time than pressuring us to forgive ourselves for allowing ourselves to be hurt. People need to forgive themselves, and they need to forgive those around them, because it is necessary in order to be able to live comfortably. And when they don't forgive, when they are scared and when they are inward looking, they find that the people that they are angry at, resentful of, vengeful towards are often the other, the person that is the most easy to dislike, the person that is most easy to tread down on. And so the problem in this world, we haven't woken up this morning and it turns out we are, for example, too soft on crime. No, check the news. Everything is still exactly as you thought it was. The reason why, for example, some crimes do not get punished is because the levers of power work in a way that prevents them from getting punished on either side. For most crimes, we are far too harsh on them. And even worst of all is the things that we thought should be crimes, for example, 50 years ago, like maybe smoking marijuana, should not actually be crimes at all. And so it's good that we value things like forgiveness, or it would be good to value something like mercy, just because it comes back to something like humility, which is that maybe if we're not so good, we were wrong about who ought to be punished and who should not be. And that's why at the end of this, we think that importantly, forgiveness suggests that we err on the side of not harming others. The opposite of forgiveness is obviously vengeance. It's giving them an eye for an eye. And the reason that obviously doesn't work is because it brings us down to the level of the sinner in the first place by inflicting the same harm on them. But we think you should be extremely confident in yourself before you do a harm on the other and get to feel like you are the good person. And for that reason, we value forgiveness. What am I going to do in this speech? I'm going to re-explain some of the key material that was missed by opening government. I'm then going to spend, hopefully, quite a long time responding to a POI from CG, which you guys could get scripting now, because we forgive OG. They know not what they have done, but we think they've run away from the key core of that debate, and we want to know how it's going to be playing out in the second half. So, first, on interpersonal forgiveness, we told you that a large amount of forgiveness, it happens on an interpersonal basis with people incredibly close to you. And this material is likely to be the most important in the debate for this reason, because even in our current society, we know that it is not the place of the bystander to forgive. It is only the place of the actual victim who gets to forgive something. So it happens on an incredibly small scale usually. And the person who wrongs you, therefore, is often someone who is very important to to you. It is someone like your mother or your friend or your child, for example. And you need to forgive them because you need to work with them every day, because most Karens don't get fired, because you have to stay in this house until you can move out, and because in the end that person is important to your mental, emotional and spiritual survival as a human being. And you of course need to forgive yourself, the person whose sins you see every day. And without that, you feel a lot of pain and anger towards them. I'll take CG. Oh, please, baby, let me. Where are you? Oh no, I can't hear them. Come in literally anytime, interrupt me, I'm ready for it. Okay, just speak up whenever you think of it. So we think for that reason, we ought to be forgiving of people who are close to us because it is important for us. What is the alternative to forgiveness? The alternative to forgiveness is essentially that vengeance that I spoke about. And importantly, people can earn that forgiveness on either side of the house. But what OG says is that this means that people can come back into the society too early, which is actually an incredibly good thing to happen, because importantly, it doesn't stop anyone. Go. Yeah, I'm ready.
For all those reasons that you have been telling us, don't you think that even without this being perceived as a virtue, people are still going to forgive?
So it doesn't need to be perceived as a virtue for people to forgive anyway. Well, firstly, if people are going to forgive anyway, and those people are good, we think that they should get to feel virtuous about themselves for doing it. Also, by being perceived as a virtue, it's kind of something that has multiple connotations, and most of them is that it is better than your initial instinct towards vengeance, anger, hatred, retribution. That the most virtuous thing you can do is kind of put a hold on those emotions and wait. And in order for it to be, don't say chance to engage, you're OG, and that you get to essentially have you get to essentially hold back. And the final reason that it is virtuous is because it is something that helps you to essentially feel virtuous about yourself, because you have to forgive yourself for your own sins. In terms of forgiveness on a grand scale, we forgive evil because evil is incredibly banal, famously, and that we have to hate the sin and not the sinner. What does this mean? For example, OG gives us the example of the police person who shoots somebody. What hating the sin and not the sinner means is recognizing that in a system that is set up to kill and lock up black people and re-enslave them, that one individual in a park is essentially believing that they are, quote, just doing their job, famously. And what we ought to do is defund them, take their guns, take their military gear, and take them off the streets. If similarly, every person who works some banal corporate job, stealing the money from the poor to funnel it into the pockets of the rich, is not evil. They are someone who should be essentially forgiven for who they are. It is not that there are a few bad apples working at the big banks causing them to be evil. It is that we all ought to look at those structures that create harm in our society. We live in a world that essentially bends towards justice. When it cannot bend fast enough, at least forgive yourself for being imperfect. Even perhaps, OG, forgive yourself when you can't be that forgiving. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. To start the closing half, I'd like to invite the member of government.
One second, I need to sort my papers. Janko's table is very weird, so forgive me, Chair, for I have taken your time in vain. Can you hear me, by the way?
Yep.
Yeah. Where's my water? I don't think it was one minute. I don't know. Sorry. I would literally die if I didn't do this. Again, you will have to forgive me. Thanks. Let's start my speech in 3, 2, 1. So this debate is not about whether forgiveness is good or bad. We say sometimes it is good, sometimes it is bad, but rather whether the broad societal belief that it is a virtue is good or not. I'm going to give you a crucial piece of framing that outframes to some extent opening government and opening opposition. Then I'm going to move on towards our case, which is what this actually debate is about. So there's a distinction between actually forgiving somebody and performing the act of forgiveness. And it's a crucial distinction to say. Actual forgiveness is a process that takes time, and it is something that is above the control of any narrative and belief in society, because it has a play in your emotions, in your, how do you say, things like pride, rationalizations, anger, interactions with all of these other things. A lot less influence on this, even though it might be, to some extent, it's very minor fact that you are actually going to forgive because there is some belief out there, rather than all of the other things that are completely out of your control, like your emotions, but also like personal experiences that you have with this person. How much did they hurt you? This is all of the things that belief doesn't really have that much influence on. What is much easier is performing the act of forgiveness and not actually forgiving, which is what actually happens on their side of the house. So the amount of forgiveness to some extent, especially because they're defending the status quo, is to some extent similar, but for the amount of actual forgiveness is much less, which ruins the relationships and puts people in worse positions on their side of the house. One extraneous piece of rebuttal, because like a majority of things are outframed, but like one, this like huge impacts from opening opposition. Notice that opening opposition is defending the status quo narrative, right? Which means that all of their examples and analysis of how people are disenfranchised, like different things about different people, this is true in the status quo, right? So insofar that their analysis is true, insofar that the belief, societal belief, is not effective already, showing in that sense. We believe this is because there are many other narratives, counter narratives, incentives that bring people being disenfranchised in the world. We think this is regrettable. We just don't think that a narrative as this is able to like change society as they like, especially because this is like a biblical narrative. It existed for so long, and we lived up in a pretty fucked up society throughout the years, even without this. Like slavery existed during this narrative. We don't see that there's huge societal changes because of the narrative, even though I know debaters like to pretend that there are. But let's move on to the actual case, which is the most important. Why the actual forgiveness is going to decrease and like heavily ruin people's like relationships. We believe that majority, how do you say, and this affects like every person in society. Like this affects every personal relationship that anybody has with somebody, especially because like it's not like forgiveness and like interactions with humanity is not just when something huge happens. It's also in daily interactions and how you, how do you say, manage problems in your relationship in this situation. So we say that like with this belief, there is a pressure to forgive and move on quite quickly on their side of the house. There is a pressure to normalize this relationship, because like for a reason, why are you staying mad for so long? Like why are you so emotional? Why can't you be rational and think about this in a certain way? So we believe the problem with usually calling something a virtue is that virtue signaling comes afterwards, right? Which means that if you want to, how do you say, perceive yourself as being good, you're much more likely to, how do you say, perform this act, even though psychologically you're not ready to perform this act. There's some horrible consequences based on this, which you're going to come over in a second. But let's first of all talk about this, how do you say, this thing. So we believe the most important thing in these personal relationships, if you want to better them, is to talk, is to actually have conflict, is to actually maybe not forget for a long period of time and forgive for a long period of time, but actually it might lead to breakup of relationship fully, but that might actually be the correct thing, because like if under their side of the house, in which what we're bringing you, it's much more likely that you're sweeping things under the rug, because necessarily complex issues, if you want to forgive faster, if you want to be perceived as virtuous in that sense, you can't really talk them through in that much as opening tables want you to believe. You actually do have to move on because it's emotionally scarring. So this means you sweep things under the rug. So the foundation of your relationship with your spouse, with your family members, with your friends is based on the house of cards built on a pile, on the rug of pile things that you pulled under it, right? The problem is this foundation is much more likely to crack later, how do you say, in this association, and to escalate into much higher drama. Usually relationships don't break away and people think, oh, why did they break up? It's a complicated answer. It's not one event, they cheated on them, but it's a series of small events of not talking about it and forgiving and moving on, which actually led them to this, which leads to worse relationship. But it's even worse, how do you say, because like you're punished for bringing this back, right? This is what seems unreasonable. So when your girlfriend or somebody brings up something that you did like 10 years ago or something else 5 years ago or something, you say, wow, why are you bringing that up now? You forgave me, we moved on from this or something else. But it's quite natural because they haven't moved on and you have lived in lies in their sort of situation. This is the most important thing because it literally affects every single relationship that people have. But let's talk about other things, right? In this situation, how you feel. As I said, the majority of things, this doesn't include how much actual forgiveness there will be, but it will be how you feel about your decision to perform this act of forgiveness and saying, I forgive you in this sort of situation. There is also third parties that have, a stake in you, normalizing relationships. This is usually your family members, if your spouse is there, if your spouse is there, or sometimes your friends, that you have common friends with your, person who did something to you. This is not a problem. This is why we don't cast out abusers from society, because there is this pressure that is then put on the victim. In what sense, right? In a sense that you are trying to basically emotionally bully them into perform this act, as in everything will get normal after this. So you're trying to say stuff like, oh, but they have changed. Oh, they're feeling so bad. Their life is in ruins now, or in this sort of situation, which means that this victim who is reliving through trauma is also now feeling guilty about not forgiving and not letting this other person move on. Like, why are you being so unreasonable in this situation? Why is it quite reasonable that your pain is still something that is haunting you in this situation? But even if you perform this act, in that sense, you also feel worse, right? Under that side of the house, because then you feel you betrayed your own ideals, because this is something that you haven't actually forgiven. You said it out loud, which means that you're first of all pressured to stay silent about it more. This is why a lot of people don't bring it up. Why did you bring it up then? Why you said you forgave them and now you say you don't? You're in a position. This is normal. You feel like you betrayed your own ideals. So you're putting a huge burden upon yourself, where the person that you now need to forgive is yourself. While you were perceiving yourself as being weak, was you were actually being a normal human being who wasn't able to move on, and whose society pressured to move on under that side of the house, which they were not ready to do. We believe that overall this ruins the relationship in this. In insofar there are huge harms. These huge harms do not manifest in a way that opening tables talk about, but they manifest in actual forgiveness being quite undermined under their side of the house. This is why you should vote closing government. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much. I'd like to invite the member of opposition to start the closing opposition's case. Here.
Hi, can people hear me?
Yep.
Okay, good. I'm going to start my speech in 3, 2, 1, go. Right, so from closing opposition, we're really glad that closing government talked about forgiveness as a virtue and not the actual forgiveness itself. That's precisely the frame that we're planning to run, and we're going to engage directly with them through my main substantives. So my extensions, everything, will integrate my rebuttals into it. Let's begin. I'm going to talk about 3 main things in my extension. Firstly, I'm going to talk about why it's much easier for you to veer towards vengeance than forgiveness, and why forgiveness is a more complex emotion. That's why we need to make it a virtue in society, so that we have more spotlight on it, more attention on it, and a better understanding of it. Secondly, I'm going to talk about how we get the good kinds of forgiveness that we get, rather than the performativity that Miloš talks about. And lastly, I'm going to talk a little bit about minorities, and then at the end, if I have time, do some weighing up. So let's begin with that. Firstly, let's talk about the complexity of emotions. Look, it's really easy to be angry. It's really easy to do what all of Gov wants us to do, which is to demand for vengeance, demand for justice, be angry, fight back against the system. When you're being hurt, your first response is being angry. That's a visceral response. It's an emotional response that overtakes your rational mind. It overtakes all other calculus. So therefore, we say that it's much easier, and like this is the natural response that most people veer to. Therefore, we don't think that it is natural for us to veer towards the virtue signaling of forgiveness that CG talks about. Rather, we think that forgiveness is a very difficult concept to understand, and it's instead when we don't have that virtue that we end up having a bad understanding of forgiveness. What does this look like? I mean, forgiveness, number one, is an incredibly internal process. So without sufficient spotlighting of what forgiveness looks like, warrants actual forgiveness rather than just performativity or surface level forgiveness, you don't actually have a good sense of what you're even demanding of people, let alone what other considerations that go into it. Secondly, it means that oftentimes the hurt that's caused to you is one that's it's on a deeply personal level. It's something that's difficult to talk about by victims. It's something that's difficult to express to other people who haven't gone through the same experiences. So therefore, it's easy for the other side, it's easy for like society to judge you and be like, why are you not forgiving enough, if we don't have that narrative that counterbalances against it. So I think that all of the bad stuff that closing government talk about is actually what happens in the absence of the narrative of virtue, or like the belief in society that forgiveness is a virtue, because you get less discussion about forgiveness, you get less like understanding of it, and forgiveness as a concept is inherently something that's quite difficult to understand because it happens so much within your internal psyche rather than something that's being expressed towards other people. What's the counter of this, and therefore the second point about why we are more likely to have better caricatures or better better signaling effects for what virtuous forgiveness looks like. This probably means stuff like valorizing it in media, right? Like other things that are virtues, like charity work, philanthropy. That's the stuff that gets news headlines. That's the stuff that we talk about within the media, within movies. Like lots of other virtues about like justice or about love. Like those are the things that we want to that we care about within emotional stories and narratives. It's so easy in society to like just care about the anger and the vengeance because those are the sexy action movies, rather than care about this internally complex and difficult to put into words process. It's only when forgiveness is a virtue, when we recognize that this is something that society should aspire towards in terms of being able to be someone that can forgive, but also being someone that wants to seek forgiveness, as forgiveness being something that is being celebrated within society, that we actually have the impetus to care about that in the media. We have the impetus to care about educating people about what this process looks like. What does this mean? This means that philosophers, teachers, lots of like therapists, we have like our therapists like now being able to chip in and being like, this is the process for which you get to forgiveness. This is the process through which you process pain and trauma. Like those are the things that we end up having, those are the conversations that we end up having when we're able to say that it's a virtue. We're able to have lots and lots of movies in both quantity and in the quality of movies that we get, or the quality of like media and shows that we get, that actually talk about what that process of forgiveness looks like. Sure, there are moments where you backtrack. There are moments where like you think that you forgave someone, and then like 5 years later in another fight, you like bring up all of their past like hurt, all the past things that they've done to hurt you, like Milos talks about. That's going to be represented in movies as well, right? Because that is now sexy if forgiveness is the crux in which we think society should care about, and that societal like morality or like what societal good is centered around. You want to be able to be someone that can sustainably forgive someone for a long period of time, to truly forgive someone. It's only when we actually have this that we're able to call out that performativity. For example, we think that charity is virtuous. We are able to call out when people are just virtue signaling towards caring about minorities, or like donating money to charity but not actually like caring about what the charity work actually does. We are able to scrutinize what charitable organizations do and when they are corrupt and take the money for their own means rather than for actually creating good impacts on people. That's because we think that charity is a virtue, therefore society cares about it, therefore there's more media attention on it. If this is not inherently a sexy idea, then we're not going to get all of that attention. I'll take Oji now.
Today, we generally are not too soft on crime, specifically because the privileged already have other virtues that override forgiveness. But for many other crimes, such as racism or sexual assaults, they are forgiven and not punished enough because people are tending to forgive too much.
Okay, number one, we're not talking about crime at all. That's so like, fine, you're about them, whatever. Number two, like, I mean, you got that in, sure, that's fine. But number two, I think that like, on Gov, there is a concession that some forgiveness is good. There are some times when forgiveness is good. The Gov premise is that we skew too much to forgiveness and status quo. That's why we can't make it a virtue. I showed A, why we don't skew towards forgiveness and status quo, or in the absence of this virtue narrative, because it's easier to be vengeful and angry. But B, why even if people want to forgive on Gov's fault, they don't know how to forgive, because forgiveness is a complex and very confusing thing. Like most people don't even understand their own emotions, let alone understand other people's emotions and understand why they should seek other people's forgiveness. And therefore it's only on our side that even people who want to forgive are able to forgive successfully. Okay, so let's talk about minorities, since like, I mean, everyone, the rest of the debate wants to talk about that. I think OO wants minorities to remain, OG wants minorities to remain angry. That's really tempting, and I can understand why that's intuitively something that it's easy to buy into, right? Like, it's easy to say, of course we want to fight against the system, of course we want to be able to strike down the systems of oppression. It's not that easy to actually do it, and I think the problem that we have on side closing opposition is that if you do it at the wrong time, and if you let the anger overtake yourself instead of being strategic about when to fight against the system and when to turn the other cheek, then you end up having more anger and you end up having worse spiraling effects. What does this mean? For example, if you're a minority and you are angry at the system, you lash out against the system. The majority does not think that you are in the right because they are not empathetic. They don't have the emotional maturity that comes from this narrative of forgiveness being a virtue and the exploration of forgiveness as a virtue. So they think that they're in the right, and they think that what is just to them is to lash out against you because you're the one that's doing the wrong to them. And so therefore they protect their daughters, protect their wives, protect their like way of life, whatever. They lash out against you, and then you get angry and you lash out against them. It's a never-ending cycle, number one. But number two, it also justifies their further oppression of you because now there is no pressure for them to forgive you. And so I think this makes it much, much worse and makes it less likely for you to have change because it increases the tension between both sides. On our side, what we get is stuff like MLK, right? People that are able to sit down and be peaceful at times and use violence or anger strategically at other times, not because they are angry in themselves as a visceral reaction, but because they think it's the correct time to strike out against the system. They're able to play the waiting game, which is incredibly hard if you're not able to let go of the harm and the hurt that has been done to you. For those reasons, we think you get better change for minorities. We think you get better understanding of forgiveness. Very happy to oppose.
All right, thank you very much. To conclude the Gov case, I'd like to invite the Gov whip. Here.
Can you hear me, Amrit?
Yep.
Okay. Just give me 15 seconds to consolidate my papers. Okay, so I will begin in 1, 2, 3. Okay, let's get straight into the refutation. First, I want to deal with opening up in some extraneous reasons. Firstly, about things such as creating of lynch mobs and violence and this counter-narrative against the violence. Presumably, we have the very same laws that they claim in rebuttal to their opening government. Next thing they tell us is that in order to believe that people are good, you need to believe in narrative of forgiveness. First of all, we do not believe this is the case. In fact, we believe that exactly why their case is weak is because we have so many other narratives, such as be a good person, have dignity, do no harm, that are not correlated with this narrative. That also, helps you believe that people are good people, and also because you want to, because you want to hang out with them. Then lastly, what opening up tells us is in response to RPI, when we say, well, the quantity of forgiveness is going to be more or less the same on both sides of the house, they say, well, at least there is, how to say, at least you feel good about something being virtuous. But the problem is that if OO claims that forgiving has so many awesome benefits, which we agree it does in many instances, then just the added value of you feeling actually good about because it's being virtuous is just minor, basically, in this debate. Everything else we think from OO and OG is problematic when they do not realize that, and CO to some extent, the quantity of forgiveness will more or less remain the same. What are the reasons for that? First of all the reasons why OO tells you that people feel good about forgiveness are actually the major motivating factor as to why people want to forgive when it is rightful that they do forgive, which is presumably much more important than having some societal narrative that exists in the society. But secondly, because of what Miloš tells you, and he gives you many reasons so, some of the most important being that forgiving is something deeply personal that affects your interpersonal relationship. Okay, if my friend betrays me, if someone I love betrays me, I'm not going to go back to movies that I watched. Okay, I'm going to think very deeply about the complexity of our relationship, whether he's deserving or not deserving of actual forgiveness. Okay, not virtue signaling forgiveness, but actual forgiveness, actual forgiveness in this debate. But overall, what this narrative does, and this is where CEO fails to deal with us, right, is that they want a world in which we have these movies and like in general, we want to have this narrative in our society. Where they miss is that we analyze that if something is virtue, the effect is not that you're deep inside yourself going to go for it, but rather that you are going to virtue signal that you are the person who is going to forgive. So we have this in popular culture and things like that. The CEO has case. We say the impact is not that people are going to be more forgiving and things like that, but rather that things that Miloš tells you are going to happen. If you have conflict with someone very important in your life, you're less likely to enter real conflict, even if you're going to fight each other for 5, 10, 15 years, and then either solve it out or just break up relationship, which is also perfectly fine in many situations. You're going to just get over it, right? And when you get over it, you're going to get into fucked up relationships with people around you because you have things deep inside your psyche that you have never solved, and 10 years later they go under the surface. The reason why this is the most important argument in this debate is because whether you're rich, poor, powerful, powerless, what makes you satisfied in life, wherever you live in this earth, is how much of the meaningful relationships you have built in people, how many friendships, how much love is there in your life. We say that this is decreasing. So to explain it, more or less quantity remains the same, but where forgiveness is actually necessary and where it is good is happening most on side of closing government, because we are more likely to enter this conflict. Why are we also more likely to enter this conflict? And to go right into Milo's second point about victims. What's the problem with victims that is different from what OG tells you? When something is a virtue, other people are pushing you towards it. This is where we get like narratives such as, oh, you should forgive me. It's so difficult for him because somebody hit you, assaulted you, or whatever. Like he's having hard times coping with it. You should really forgive him, etc., etc. It doesn't matter whether you forgive or not. What matters, and this is crucial, right? It's not about forgiveness. It's how this virtue makes you feel, and it makes you feel like piece of shit, even if you have been previously extremely victimized, because there is this overall narrative how we should forgive. Oh, Jesus forgave it because that they put him on the cross and things like that. We say that this is very, very. This is very, very. Yes, this is very, very harmful in the society. But let's deal more with what CEO fails, where CEO fails this debate. I have a couple of responses to their problems, which are also problems of this debate. Note, just because the CA team set the motion about this societal belief or this narrative, doesn't mean that this narrative is stronger than other many narratives that exist in the society. Meaning that in general, narratives don't have much impact on, even if they exist in popular culture, insofar as how people build their interpersonal relationship, how they build their lives. Why is that? Because you have narratives, you should be a dignified person, you should be a good person, principle of doing not harm, principle of not being racist, principle about helping your neighbor, narrative about helping each other when you need. All these narratives make us be good people, you know. It is unclear to me why this narrative is so particularly strong, and the reason why it is unclear to me is because it is not. Oh, wow. POI.
Your case is premised on forgiveness not being a choice, but your analysis suggests it's a conscious process. Don't your family tell you to forgive because it's the right call when the counterfactual says to be vengeful? If they wanted to make you shut up, can't the
Thank you. But counterfactual is not to be vengeful, because we have millions of other competing narratives that are telling you not to be vengeful. So for instance, we have a narrative that tells you vengeance is something bad, and many others, such as be a good person. So I don't think that case has a good standing. So what Sarah says, right? This is one problem that they said. But the second problem with what she says is that, we want society to change, etc., etc. But they miss Miller's point. So Sarah cannot defend alternative world where everyone is loving and we're hippies forgiving, going to, you know, concerts and things like that. They defend fucking status quo, okay? Which Miloš in his extension explain you what this status, what this status quo likes. Third problem with their case about therapists now being more likely to help you, etc., etc. Note, therapist is going to be more likely to help you, especially because all of these remedying factors of forgiveness, psychologically, that O talks about, not because he heard in his narrative, but because he's a medical professional who is going to help you defending it. But overall, the biggest problem with their case is that they have very major missing link between something being virtue and how this affects our psychology. We say psychology is affected by our interpersonal relationship, narrative effects, pressure, and us feeling bad in the society we live in. Very proud to propose.
All right, thank you very much. To conclude the op case and indeed the debate, I'd like to invite the op. Here.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Cool, gonna start in just a second. All right, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm gonna be talking about two things, and then maybe I'll do some like implicit weighing, but it's very early in the morning still, so I might just have to rely on us obviously being right to win a debate rather than doing any hard work. So hopefully. So what we want to be doing here is quite simple. We want to be talking about like the personal level. We want to be talking about the societal level. What's important in framing to understand is that and I think the judges probably do note this, is like that the concept of what exactly it means to forgive is in something which is being challenged in this debate. What exactly does that look like, as is what is happening in the alternative, like in the various alternative worlds. This is important because we think that what we've been able to do is really contextualize what it means specifically that forgiveness is a virtue, what that means that it looks like in society, and what the more obvious competing, not narrative, but visceral emotions would be regardless. And we think that this is the important thing when we look at weighing in this debate. So let's go into the case first. So let's begin with the societal level stuff. So in the societal level stuff, OG point out a lot of stuff, and they're like, listen, look, there is like shit things that happen in the world, like, you know, and people get upset, and then they're just told to forgive, and then we don't get societal change. I will tell them already, look, most of the problems that you're talking about don't seem to really change, because like, oh, we don't necessarily understand what's happening, because the structures exist on both sides. So like the power structures, everything else, like the ability to manipulate exists. So what exactly is happening? Like what exactly is going to happen here if you do this? They get told back, like, listen, what is happening is actually that we have more deterrence in order for people to not do additional actions. And also we don't give people moral licensing in order to go forward. But the question that we had to ask here was like, how do then minorities or people in the world that they exist in get change and get pushed forward? Because the ideas of deterrence mean that there is actually a negative action that needs to come about by the fact that, like, I haven't forgiven this other person. The problem is that what we point out and what Sarah points out is that minorities have less access to begin with to all of the other tools that they want to be talking about, i.e. the tools of vengeance and oppression and everything else, i.e. the ability to lash back. We asked this in a POI to Coco to begin with, and he kind of goes, yeah, but people need to get along, I guess. But that ignores the differences in the power structures that already exist, which means that these minorities are less likely to be able to push back. But also what we tell you specifically here, Sarah, is that it is really bad if you push people who are weaker to act back in an angular and visceral way, to do the things which Coco and Monica would want you them to do in order to create this deterrence, because that creates a system where they will simply get oppressed more. Because if they lash out, and they have less power, when they get hit back, they'll get hit back harder and they will stay down. So either you get the worst case scenario, you get cyclical, but we think actually what happens is it leads to far greater oppression. So in the societal level, we would rather there be a place where forgiveness is a thing, A, so that the minorities can access it, because we think that in a lot of the cases, the only thing that they might be able to do is to forgive because they can't specifically act, but B, so that they can use this power of anger and of forgiveness strategically, as Sarah points out, in order to make a change. And that on the other side, there will also be an understanding of that forgiveness is a thing, and that they themselves, i.e. like the majority, might have done something bad that they need to ask forgiveness for. So we think that this is something which is quite clearly why, a clear reason why it is that forgiveness, specifically as we analyzed it, creates an ability for societal change. Let's move on to the second issue of the personal level. And I do think this is like really important. I think this is an important part in this debate, because I think like a lot of the other stuff kind of stems through this. So OG tell us, look, people are just pressured into doing this on one side, right? People are pressured into forgiving. O tell you, look, but people want to be able to move on, and like it's important for friends and family. And if forgiveness, by the fact that forgiveness is a virtue, it's more available to you, and therefore you're more likely to use it. Now CG like hone in on this, and they say, look, you've given us loads and loads of reasons as to why it is that logically you should forgive people. Ergo, we should forgive people. And then they also tell us, but listen, there are also like all these other great narratives around. I'll deal with the narratives in a sec, but what's important to note is what Sarah tells you is that, listen, the ability and access to forgiveness is a more complex and not an emotion, right? It is something, a societal construct, unlike anger, unlike vengeance, which are like raw emotions, which are deep inside our psyche and very easily inaccessible, which is why we need this to balance it. And again, I think this is really important, because this is what kind of shows you where this debate is at. We need the forgiveness and the virtue in order to balance out what is a more raw, visceral emotion of anger, which would otherwise push us into a different place. And we think that this creates a situation, right, where you can then access it, because the logic stuff that Milos and Bianco want to talk about don't actually make sense, because people don't process stuff like that, especially if they remain in the point of anger going on. The same analysis that I used just now in the minorities is true here as well. A person staying in a point of anger can't access those emotional links that OO want to talk about as why they're beneficial, right, to me as a person, because they're staying in an emotional state. It is only by having a construct of forgiveness that you're able to break from that and then create things. That's why this logical stuff and the analysis that they try to provide there in closing really doesn't make sense. Then they say the other narrative. Look, guys, I actually don't understand what they mean here. So like, A, we don't think a narrative on like general things are good enough because of all the reasons we said why it's the raw emotion. But like, if their narrative stuff is like, oh, you should be a good person and you shouldn't strike back, and then you should do what, right? Like you should forgive people. Like they just gave you a bunch of other names of narratives which are like forgiveness. So it's unclear why they would stand by them and not others. I'll take closing now if they have anything.
Okay, so Benji, what you miss in our case is that we tell you that when something is virtue, it creates social pressure and virtue signaling, whereas emotionally, you want to forgive and that is not comparative. You didn't deal with that point.
Right, cool. I think what we've done is we've explained to you, A, why we don't think that forgiveness is a thing, is as readily an accessible emotion as anger itself. We think that like anger is a more raw emotion, it's more readily accessible to us. There's a reason, for instance, why anger is not a virtue, but forgiveness was chosen. And the reason for that, among other things, is because it's a harder thing for us to talk about. But we also then explain to you why virtue signaling happens on your side when we have a poorer concept of what forgiveness means as a whole inside society. What Yanko misses is because when there is like, when we care about forgiveness and we show it in movies and we specifically think about it as a virtue. So we give people like we give teachers and educators and philosophers and religious leaders the ability to access this and describe and define what it means, then we get much better concept of what a forgiveness means. Otherwise, you would get the performative stuff and you would get people forgiving people too quickly, as CG want to talk about on their side of the house. On our side of the house, we show people both good ways and bad ways of forgiving. We teach them this through many, many different societal processes, which are really impactful. CG's only thing is like, there's no impact here. But clearly there is, right? Like clearly seeing this in films, being taught about this by your teachers, by your parents, and showing you all of the good and bad ways means that you have better reasons and ability to access what forgiveness truly looks like. And we think that that's at the end of the day why we win this debate. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you very much, Opwib, and indeed everyone for the debate. So if you are not a judge, please skedaddle out of here. We will call you back from the main room once we are done, which shouldn't be long, hopefully. Cool, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Let's see what happens.